Shed log, 15th of March 2020. Hello, I'm Robert and welcome to my shed. So, this is my temporary workbench rig that I've been using for the past week to make joints. Rather than going straight into making the joints of my workbench, I decided to do some practice ones first, because that seemed sensible. So, quick recap on types of joint. This is a butt joint, one of the four main joint types. A butt joint, if you don't throw the wood on the floor, is when you take two pieces of wood and you just put them together, like that. That's a butt joint, or like that. Doesn't really matter which way around. The point of a butt joint is that your pieces of wood are held together end on, so they are butting. This isn't really a join, but you can make it into a join by screwing or gluing or pegging or what have you to hold them. It's not very strong, it's not one I'll be using, but it is one of the standard joints, so I thought I'd throw it in there. And the next joint I made was the dovetail joint. This is a joint I was hoping not to have to use, but it seems like it's the only way I can hold the vise on. Quickly, you cut a dovetail shape, which is wide on that bit, narrow on that bit, as an angle, and a corresponding slot, which is the same angle. All done with a tenon saw and hammer and chisel. I then tried to knock this into that, and I split the wood. I don't know if you can see it very well on the camera, but there's a definite split in there. That's because I didn't remove all the materials I needed to remove before going at it. So I made another one. This one I cut the dovetail with a tenon saw. I cut this slot out with a coping saw. That's a really bad idea. I know a better way of doing that now, which I'll come to later. And start on the next one. There would be three of these, and that's basically representing the dead short for the tail vise. Recorded a snip a few days ago on that's when I made it, and I might include that. So that's the dovetail. The next kind is a mortise and tenon. This is the one I finished off yesterday. You cut a square hole, a rectangular hole, into one piece of wood, and you cut a rectangular peg, I've got tenon, into the other piece. Ways to remember which one's which. A mortise is the same thing as you cut when you want to fit a mortise lock in a door. So it's a square hole that the lock pushes into. The tenon is cut using a tenon saw. Another thing that helps me is that a mortise can be cut using a tool called a mortisizer. I've never seen a mortisizer, I don't know what one is, but I like the word. I gather it's a kind of router, or variation on a router. Did I cover the half-lap joint? Half-lap joint is very simple. Two pieces of wood, cut half of each, slot them together. It's really strong if the pressure is pushing this piece up or pushing this piece down. That's going to hold. Anything else is just moves. It is occasionally useful, and I'll be using it to hold on the face vise, or at least the pieces of wood that the face vise support will bolt into, which I'm calling the face vise supports. Yesterday, as well as cutting myself shaving and hitting myself with a chisel, I also made my first face vise support. In fact, I made two of these. The first one broke because I tried to chisel straight into a knot and it just snapped the wood. I also lost my drill bit snapped off in the job, and I was able to dig it out with a hammer and chisel and a pair of pliers. So it's a good tip: if you lose the work, don't panic. Piece of metal in the wood where you don't want it, you can get it out. Meet the workbench, part 2. The idea is a face vise will be here, and there are 3 dog holes here. 3 sets of dog holes here, and they go back in a grid. The tail vise will be here, and this has 2 dog holes here and here. They go back in the same grid. The reason there's no dog hole here is because it's close to the wall. I didn't think I would be using it. But if I need one, I can always cut them out. They're just 3/4 inch holes. Fun fact, 3/4 of an inch is 19 millimeters and 5.00 microns. So 19 mil and 3/4 of an inch are pretty well interchangeable for woodworking purposes. 5 microns is not a tolerance you can get to with wood, or even metal, to be honest, unless you're keeping the pressure constant. So, for working, I've got this workmate on the bottom, and I've literally just placed the workbench on top of it. It's actually scratched the paint a bit on the wall, which I'm going to have to tidy up. Okay, so I plan to use a couple of other types of joint. These are the pegged through mortise and tenon. This is a joint that was, I think, as I understand it, perfected by the Amish for use in barns, which are built out of rough sawn wood, effectively. So it's really good for joints that might loosen up over time and you tighten them up. It's also exceptionally strong and will eat up any lateral forces that happen on the bench. I plan to use that for the bench legs, which are these pieces connecting to the shelves, which are these pieces and the piece over there. So I don't have one to show you because they take a long time to make. I've not practiced these yet, but this basically, you cut a tenon into the end of the piece of wood, as big as you can. You cut a mortise, same size as the tenon. You probably actually want to cut the mortise first because mortises are a lot harder to get right in terms of size. You cut the mortise, you cut the tenon. The tenon goes right the way through the wood. So you want it about that long. Good extra length. That's why these pieces are just so long. It's extra length for the tenon. You then cut a secondary mortise into the tenon itself. And you can't root it. You have to use a hammer and chisel because that secondary mortise has a chamfer on it. The top is wider than the bottom. Then cut a peg, which the top is wider than the bottom, and that is longer than the tenon, longer than the width of the tenon or the depth of the secondary mortise. Basically, you knock the peg into the hole and everything tightens up. The secondary mortise has to be slightly short of the tenon, so it pulls this piece forward as the peg goes down. And you want it to go down so that gravity is working with you. If you get the angle right, it's a big if, then it will be rock solid and it will stay pretty much forever more. And if the wood shrinks due to wood doing what it does, aging, then quite simply you can knock it down with a hammer, with a mallet, and make it stronger. The other thing I'm going to be using, the type of joint, is the double mortise unflit tenon. Now the idea of this is you have a piece of wood, in my case a bench top, and another piece of wood running parallel with it, in this case the rails at the top of the bench, and you want to join the two together. The logical, obvious first thing is to just screw from one to the other, and that works. I don't like screws because if one piece moves against the other, the screw will not only snap, it will gouge out horrible holes. and screws do loosen if you tighten them, screw them and unscrew them a few times. They're very good the first time you screw them in, but if I ever do move the bench and want to take it apart, after a few moves it will start to become a little bit looser and need work, whereas a knockdown floating tenon will just work. So the way that works is very simple. You cut a half-blind mortise and tenon into both pieces of work, either using a router or hammer and chisel, and you take a piece of wood the same size as both of the holes put together, and you knock the assembly together like that. So yeah, those are the two variations on the joint that I'm going to be using, but I haven't previously discussed. So mounting a temporary vise onto here, I decided I needed a vise to work with. Because I didn't want to just clamp everything to work. The vise holds things a lot more firmly than the clamp. And so I mounted this vise, which also came in my house, onto this piece of plywood. Now this vise is a record 1 ton Sheffield, England vise, which I have sanded down and repainted, which is why the paint job's not brilliant, because I painted it by hand with a cheap brush. But it's rust-proof paint, so it will last, well, it will outlive the workbench, I expect. And this has, as you can see, a set of dowels in the bottom that locate in the holes of the bench. Let's see if I can do this. It's a little bit fiddly, because each dowel is individually adjusted. But when you get it right, it will sit down. And if you watch there we go. This is pretty much as I've had it. These cheeks came from another vise which I bought, which is, you may have seen, which is a record number 52.5A, English made 9-inch face vise with quick release, and that is going under the bench. I'm just going to set this down because it's heavy. Oof. That's going underneath the bench. That's upside down. Everything's covered in sawdust now. And so yeah, that's what I've been using. That's all for this week. Next week, some more joining of wood. Ta-ta! I don't know to what extent you can see the dog holes in it, but there are holes in a regular grid pattern. It's impossible for me to do that, apparently, without throwing this on the floor. So